There are conflicting views of monarchy even within the book of Samuel. Okay, you can see here's the anti-monarchical kind of perspective in the book of Samuel. It's a rejection of Yahweh as king, a warning against forced military service, forced field work for the royal house, forced weapon making for the military. Daughters will be taken as concubines. There will be taxation, right? And even Saul was hiding, right? So all of these things Samuel warns against in his speech to the people, right? And we even have this story that puts Saul in a very negative light. On the flip side of that, this argument for the king, for the monarchy, we have here God saying that God has chosen a king to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Right? This was exactly one of the things that the people needed a king for. Right? We do hear that the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul, right? Just in the same way that the Spirit of the Lord came upon all the judges, right? And Saul does defeat the Ammonites and is celebrated for this. So we don't have a crystal clear picture here of what the text thinks of having a king. Possibly here we have different traditions, different perspectives on whether or not Israel should have a king or not. Whether this is a good thing because Saul is good, he has delivered Israel from the Philistines, and also because this will eventually lead to David, or whether it's against the monarchy because of all of these things that are going to come. Right? All these things that Samuel is warned against. And when I was thinking about this yesterday, I kind of want to change a little bit how I talked about Saul, because I talked about Saul as being this transitional figure between the Confederacy and the monarchy. And I want to change that a little bit because I think what Samuel actually is kind of this prophetic interruption, right? Because what we have, if we look at the text, is we have Joshua through Judges kind of justifying the need for a king, right? Joshua is a strong leader, right? Just like Moses was, so we need another leader. Judges had that refrain. In those days, there was no king, and the people did what was, good in their eyes, but evil in the eyes of the Lord. So everything in Joshua and Judges kind of leads up to saying, hey, we need a king. Then right at the beginning of 1 Samuel, we have the figure of Samuel, who says all of these things about a king, right? In a sense, not speaking truth to power because there aren't any power structures yet, but speaking truth about power, right? So this very prophetic voice, there's even times when Samuel employs this repeated refrain that you all will become familiar with when we do the prophets, and that's, thus says the Lord, right? Samuel says that line. He says, thus says the Lord, and then he continues. So Samuel is kind of coming into this very prophetic role in the middle of this move towards kingship, because right after Samuel, we get Saul through Solomon. Right? And so we have the creation of the monarchy. Right? So Samuel is kind of this interesting prophetic interruption. And what's interesting too is inside the story, or kind of bookending the story of Samuel, we read that Eli's sons were taking bribes and perverting justice. Right? So we have this idea of the perversion of justice. Right? And Samuel's sons, on the other end of Samuel's story, ends the same way. Right? Samuel's sons do the same thing that Eli's sons did. So, and what did we say was the chief concern of the Deuteronomic historian? No. What was the chief sin? Right, apostasy and idolatry. And yet, in Samuel's story, we get this idea of justice. Right, kind of bookending it, which is really interesting. So, just kind of wanting to maybe give a better perspective on who Joshua is and how Joshua may be functioning in the text. Samuel, sorry.
Samuel?
How Samuel's functioning in the text, right? As this kind of prophetic interruption in this move towards kingship.
You say how Samuel is doing what?
Is a prophetic interruption. Okay, so kind of at the end of Saul's story, right, because Samuel anoints Saul to be king, Saul starts off great, but eventually by the end of his life, things are really falling apart. Samuel and Saul split ways after the story of Saul offering up this sacrifice, right, which he's not supposed to do, and Samuel calls him out for it. Pretty much right after that, Samuel and Saul never speak again. Okay, they kind of go their separate ways. The text says that God is sorry that he has made Saul king. What does this remind you of?
What, Adam and Eve?
Not Adam and Eve.
Right before the flood.
Before the flood,
Yeah.
God was sorry that he had made man, right?
Yeah.
So we get this line, God was sorry that he had made Saul king, right? And so what God does then is he sends Samuel to appoint a new king, right? Not one of Saul's sons, but a new king outside of Saul's lineage, right? And this is where we find David, because after Saul's death, pretty much like that fragile union that Saul had kind of brought together to fight the Philistine falls apart, right? All of his sons kind of start ruling different places in Israel. And this is where we get David on the scene.
Is this on
Right.
there?
Huh?
Is this on there?
It will be, yeah. David is second only to Moses in textual presence, right? Moses is the person that you see the most in the Hebrew Bible. His name pops up more than any other, and he has the most kind of narrative space, and David is second, right? We read certain character aspects, right? He's musically proficient. He has great military and tactical skill. For example, the story of Goliath and the Philistines, right? Saul was not able to defeat the Philistines, and yet one of David's beginning stories is that as a boy, he's able to defeat their mightiest warrior, right? So kind of contrasting the characters here. Saul can't do it, but David, this little scrawny shepherd boy, can defeat their best warrior, right? Two different characters. He's also a shrewd politician, right? And this kind of gets overlooked when some people see David because for some reason people have a tendency to pedestal biblical characters, all of whom are flawed, right? And horribly so sometimes. And David is one of those, right? He marries Saul's daughter so that he can, in a sense, be technically an heir, right? Right. It's a very shrewd political maneuver to marry Michal. I think.
That's her
like a
name.
giant person
Hmm?
that David defeated? Was he
Yeah.
like a giant person?
Goliath. Yeah, that's how the text portrays him. Yeah, it talks about Goliath being this giant, right? He's this huge warrior, right? Let's see here. Went too far. Okay. Sorry. Now the historicity of David is kind of in question, right? David is supposed to be this great king that kind of brings the tribes together, kind of is the first great king of Israel, and yet we have no reliable historical data for such a prominent king. Nothing archaeologically has shown up to really prove David's existence, or even the fact that he was, even if he did exist, that he was this great king as the text portrays him to be. The only thing that we really have is what's called the Tel Dan inscription. And that's T-E-L, Tel Dan inscription, right? Oops. Oof, can't spell inscription. Right? And the Tel Dan inscription is dated to several generations after David, right? So not even from David's time, but it does mention the house of David. Okay. David's reign would have been about the 10th century, right? And that's a time when archaeologically we just don't see the kind of building projects and city fortifications that we should see for a king as great as David. Especially because we have all the remains for a king in the northern kingdom just a few generations later named King Omri, right? Who's a king in the northern kingdom, and we have a lot of stuff from him. We have temples, we have palaces, we have all of these things. We have an inscription from Egyptians talking about King Omri. We have nothing else historically that talks about King David, right? Which makes it a little difficult to say that this figure was kind of who the Bible portrays him to be, as far as being this great leader who unified all the nations.
Do you believe he was a great leader?
Do I? My personal perspective is not as important. What's more important is that I'm presenting to you what scholars present. But I think what's interesting here is that if we recognize that David is potentially not an actual, or not as great an actual person, we do get a particular insight, because what we can start to see within the Deuteronomistic history, especially from Joshua to Kings, is a very strong southern perspective. And I say that because David is from the south, right? And so you have this golden child from the south, whereas every northern king that the text mentions is criticized, right? And is said to be pretty much evil, right? One of the first kings after the kingdoms kind of split when Saul dies is named Ishbaal, right? You guys remember Ish, meaning man, right? Man of Baal, right? This is probably not accidental, right? That one of Saul's sons is called a man of Baal, especially when David, we'll see later in the text, gets referred to as Son of God, right?
No, who is the son of God? You said David.
David, that phrase gets used for David. Okay. So, and the only other evidence that kind of gets used to talk about David or in support of David being as great a ruler as he is in Jerusalem. But because of how excavations have gone on there for years and years and years and decades, a lot of the evidence there is ambiguous. Just because of all the excavations and things not being handled as well as they probably should have been, which makes it difficult to say when things are from, right? Which layer they kind of relate to. So it's also the fact that Jerusalem is a city that has been built on a city on a city on a city on a city, right? And so getting at some of the old remains of Jerusalem would pretty much mean like digging totally underneath the city, which is what they're doing in a lot of places. But so that's kind of the historicity of David's rule. It's very much in question. Now, David's rise to power, like I said, is a very opportune marriage, right? Marries Michal, and his friendship with Jonathan, right? Saul's son. So now you have somebody who's technically of David's household and is kind of best buds with David's son, or Saul's son, right? And he avoids being killed many times by Saul. There's also a lot of other times where David is incredibly politically shrewd, right? I think I remember hearing the phrase when someone was talking about David that you can't stab your enemies in the back, right? You can stab your friends in the back, right? It's kind of the implication, which is something we kind of see with David. So that's kind of his rise to power. Another thing that we need to mention, okay, and this kind of goes along with it, David's rise to power, right? One of the things he does when he starts rising to power is he captures Jerusalem, right, for Israel, and he makes it the capital city. Okay? Now here's what he does. Here's what's incredibly smart of David, right? Is not only does he set up his capital in Jerusalem, but then he tells the Israelites to bring the ark to Jerusalem, right? And now remember the significance of the ark, right? This symbol of tribal unity. All the tribes in Joshua gathering around this ark. The ark is very much a symbol of tribal unity. And he's bringing this to the city saying, hey tribes, this is where we're rallying around, right? And by doing that, Jerusalem becomes the symbol of royal power and God's presence, of royal power and political power, right? These two arenas are very much collapsed or brought together in David's reign, right? Jerusalem becomes both the city of David and the city of God, right? David commissions the temple building, right? He doesn't do it, that's left to his son Solomon. But Jerusalem, by commissioning this temple to be built, Jerusalem is to be the location of the temple and the dynasty, right? You can refer to Jerusalem both as the house of David, right, which is his dynasty, and as the house of God, right? So these two things are very much brought together right? And you don't have to look too much further than our own political system to see how certain politicians kind of use popular religion to kind of get the people on their side, right? How many times have you heard politicians pray? And like of course, like everybody's gonna be like, "Oh, he's a good Christian. He prays." You just using the very ambiguous phrase God. It's like, okay, well, if he said God, then obviously he's talking about my God, so he's praying to my God, so it's the same one, right? David kind of does this, right? By bringing the ark to Jerusalem, right? Very much is getting the people on his side and unifying political power and religious power to the same place, right? David offers sacrifices just like Saul, but he's not reprimanded, right? Because what's interesting, we had Eli and we had Samuel, right? And Eli is kind of representing the priesthood, right? But his sons are corrupt, so we get Samuel. Samuel's kind of representing the priesthood. But then Samuel dies, and we just have David. There's no kind of priestly authority to tell David no, right? And by doing all of this, David is very much bringing the priesthood and the cultic life under political authority, right? Nobody says David's wrong for offering these sacrifices in the way that Samuel confronted Saul.
I didn't see where David offered the sacrifice. I saw where the one after him.
Solomon?
Solomon.
Solomon does as well.
Yeah, I saw where he
Solomon does as well. David provides kind of the precedent for that.
Oh, okay.
Yep. There's royal control over the priesthood. Priests are listed as temple officials or as royal officials, right? So David appoints people who are priests, right? Think about how people get worried when presidents appoint judges, right? Thinking, oh no, this president put this judge in charge, so they're going to be on his side. Same kind of possibility here, right? And so we see with this kind of move, that the wish that we saw in Samuel for a king like all other nations is very much what David is becoming, right? This Canaanite royal ideology of a king appointed by a deity, and not just appointed by a deity, but one who's referred to as God's son, right? This is very much kind of Canaanite royal ideology kind of seeping into Israelite social structures, right? This special relationship of adoption, a son to serve the father, and can be chastised by the God, but is never rejected, right? So let's take a look at this. If you want to turn to 2 Samuel, chapter 7, verses 8 through 16. Take a look at that and tell me kind of the important parts that you see listed there. Mm-hmm. Chapter 7, verses 8 through 16. This is the Davidic, what gets referred to as the Davidic covenant. This is God promising or speaking to David, making a promise, essentially a covenant to David. I want you to tell me what are some of the parts of this covenant. What do you see in there in that text?
Is that the land grant?
Not quite a land grant. Well, yeah.
Part of it.
Sorry, it is. Why is it? Why do you say it's a royal? We'll call it a royal grant. Why is it a royal grant?
That's from verse 10, and I will appoint a place for my people Israel and plant them.
Okay, good. So you have, again, this kind of land promised, right? The land is given.
He did say before that he would make his name a great name.
Right? So we have a great name as part of this, but a little bit separate from the royal grant. But we do see, again here, a great name and land given. What is this kind of echoing?
Abraham.
Good. What else? What else is part of this?
I will give you rest from all your enemies.
Good. What else?
This is the part where he says, I took you from the pastures, like when he brought them out of Egypt.
Okay, good. So we have here this part of the covenant, like, you're right, preamble. Thank you.
And
What
then,
else?
and then he tells him when he dies, he will raise up his offspring after him, who shall come forth. Yeah, the progeny part.
So we kind of have we'll say, but it's not just progeny, but it's the offspring will be what?
He's going to establish a kingdom through them, so I guess they'll be the kings.
All right, offspring will be kings. We'll put your progeny.
Verse 13, you said he shall build a house for my name, and then I will establish a throne of his kingdom forever.
Right. So we have this kind of mutual house building, right?
Yeah.
If you build a house for me, I'll build a house for you.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
Then it goes on to talk about how he claims him. He claimed me as the father, then I should be.
There we
then
go.
he should be the son to me.
There it is. Right? This is where you get kind of that idea of David being God's son. Right? You can say as a son. Now what's interesting here, and we'll kind of see this in just a second, is, well, I'll hold off on that. I'll hold off on that before we get there.
What verse is that?
14.
14. What else? Can David, can this covenant be broken?
No, it says he would chastise him,
Mhm.
but he would never take his love from him.
Good.
Says your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever.
So here we have, it is eternal and unconditional.
Yeah.
So those cannot be broken?
No, cannot be broken. He can be chastised, he can be punished, but the covenant can't be broken.